The blood was still warm on my uniform when I saw her again. There, in the moonlit corridor of Raven's Hollow Garrison, stood the young woman who had defied every order, every protocol, every sacred rule of military conduct to save my life. The pale light streaming through the narrow stone windows caught the copper in her auburn hair, and for a moment, I forgot the throbbing pain in my shoulder where the enemy blade had found its mark just hours before. My name is Captain Lysander Ravencroft, 28 years of age, and until that autumn night in 1684, I believed I understood the meaning of honor. I had served His Majesty's forces for nearly a decade, rising through the ranks with unwavering dedication to duty and crown. The Scottish border conflicts had hardened me, shaped me into the kind of officer who never questioned orders, never wavered in the face of enemy fire, and certainly never allowed personal feelings to compromise military objectives. But standing there, watching her emerge from the shadows like some ethereal guardian angel, I realized that everything I thought I knew about courage, about loyalty, about what it meant to be a man of honor, was about to crumble like ancient parchment. She moved with practiced silence down the corridor, her dark woolen cloak concealing what I knew to be a leather satchel filled with medical supplies. Evangeline Thornwick, the physician's daughter who had become the unofficial healer of our garrison, the woman whose very existence challenged everything our military code stood for. At 24, she possessed a knowledge of medicine that surpassed most university-trained surgeons, yet by law and custom, she was forbidden from practicing her craft. The first time I encountered her, 3 weeks prior, I had been bleeding out in a hidden cellar beneath the garrison's east wing. A Scottish raider's sword had opened a gash across my ribs that should have sent me to the official military surgeon, but some instinct I couldn't name, had led me to seek help in the shadows instead. I remember the weight of autumn fog that night, thick and concealing, as I stumbled through the maze of underground passages that honeycombed the ancient fortress. My vision had begun to blur when I pushed open a door I had never noticed before and found myself in a small, candlelit chamber that smelled of lavender and something else, something clean and healing that I couldn't identify. She had looked up from grinding herbs on a wooden board, her green eyes widening with alarm at the sight of my bloodied uniform. But there had been no hesitation, no feminine squeamishness at the gore. Instead, she had simply gestured to a crude wooden table and said in a voice like warm honey, "Lie down before you fall down, Captain." The way she had known my rank without introduction should have alarmed me. The fact that she showed no surprise at finding a wounded officer in her secret sanctuary should have sent me running back to report her unauthorized activities to Colonel Blackwood immediately. Instead, I found myself obeying, drawn by something in her manner that spoke of absolute competence and, more dangerously, genuine compassion. Her hands had been gentle but sure as she cleaned and stitched the wound, her touch sending unfamiliar warmth through my chest that had nothing to do with fever. She worked in concentrated silence, occasionally murmuring instructions for me to turn this way or that, to breathe deeply, to hold still while she secured the binding. "You treat many wounded soldiers down here," I had observed, noting the well-organized supplies, the practiced efficiency of her movements. She paused in her work, meeting my eyes with a directness that few people, male or female, dared use with a military officer. "I treat whoever needs healing, Captain Ravencroft. Rank, allegiance, and politics are luxuries the dying cannot afford." Her words had hit me like a physical blow. In that moment, I understood that this woman saw the world through a lens entirely different from my own. Where I saw enemy and ally, she saw human beings in need. Where I saw necessary military protocols, she saw barriers to mercy. The garrison surgeon, I had begun, but she shook her head. "Would report your wound to your superiors, question how you acquired it, demand details about patrol routes and enemy positions that you might not be ready to discuss." Her fingers continued their skilled work as she spoke. "Sometimes, Captain, what a man needs most is to heal in peace before facing the questions of war." She had been right, of course. The wound had come not from any authorized patrol or sanctioned engagement, but from my own foolish decision to investigate reports of Scottish raiders operating too close to our supply lines. I had gone alone, against every regulation, driven by the kind of reckless pride that gets good soldiers killed. Her discretion had saved not just my life, but my career. As she finished binding the wound, I found myself studying her face in the candlelight. High cheekbones spoke of gentle birth, though her hands bore the calluses of someone who worked with herbs and healing tools daily. Her auburn hair, pinned back practically but escaping in soft tendrils around her temples, caught the golden light like burnished copper. Why? I had asked as she helped me to my feet. Why risk treating soldiers in secret? If you were discovered, the consequences would be severe. She had gathered her supplies with the same methodical care she had shown in treating my wound, not answering immediately. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a weight that seemed far older than her years. My father trained me in the healing arts before his death 3 years ago. He believed that medical knowledge was a gift from God, meant to be used in service of all humanity. She paused, her hands stilling on the leather satchel. The military permits me to tend minor ailments among the officers' wives and children, but forbids me from treating battle wounds or serious injuries. They say such work is too brutal, too unseemly for a woman's delicate sensibilities. The bitter laugh that escaped her lips held no humor whatsoever. Tell me, Captain, what is more unseemly, a woman using her knowledge to save lives, or good men dying because protocol demands their treatment be delayed until the proper male authorities can attend them? I had no answer for her then, and as I made my way back to my quarters through the pre-dawn darkness, her question echoed in my mind like a challenge I couldn't ignore. Over the following weeks, as my wound healed cleanly without infection or complication, I found myself thinking about her words more often than was wise or appropriate for a career military officer. Now, seeing her again in this moonlit corridor, I realized that our first encounter had been merely the opening movement of a symphony that would either elevate us both to heights of happiness I had never imagined possible, or destroy everything we had worked to build in service to Crown and Country. She hadn't noticed me yet, focused as she was on whatever urgent medical mission had brought her out into the corridor at this dangerous hour. The autumn night was crisp and clear, unusual after weeks of heavy fog, and the moonlight streaming through the ancient windows created a path of silver that seemed to guide her steps towards some destiny neither of us could foresee. A soft footstep behind me made her turn, and our eyes met across the stone corridor. For a heartbeat that felt like an eternity, neither of us moved. Then recognition dawned in her green eyes, followed immediately by concern as she noticed the fresh blood seeping through my white shirt. "Captain Ravencroft," she whispered, glancing quickly up and down the corridor to ensure we were alone. "You're hurt again." "It's nothing," I replied automatically, the response drilled into me by years of military training. But even as the words left my lips, I felt the lie in them. The wound was deeper than I had initially thought, and the ride back from tonight's unauthorized reconnaissance had reopened it despite my careful binding. She approached with that same purposeful grace I remembered from our first encounter, her healer's eye already assessing the extent of my injury. "Nothing," he says, while bleeding through his uniform. There was gentle reproach in her voice, mixed with something that sounded almost like affection. "Come. We cannot remain here in the open." Without waiting for my response, she turned and began walking toward a section of the corridor I had never explored. I followed, drawn by curiosity and something deeper that I was not yet ready to acknowledge. She moved with the confidence of someone who knew these ancient passages intimately, turning down a narrow stairway that seemed to have been carved directly from the living rock. The descent led to another of the garrison's hidden chambers, this one larger than the cellar where she had first treated me. Tapestries hung on the rough stone walls, and a small fireplace provided both warmth and light. The room felt ancient, as if it had been here long before the current military installation, perhaps dating back to the Norman castle that had once stood on this site. "How many wounded have you treated in places like this?" I asked as she gestured for me to remove my shirt and sit on a wooden bench near the fire. "More than I should have, fewer than I would like to," she replied, already moving to light additional candles and prepare her supplies. There are others who share my belief that healing should not be constrained by military politics or social conventions. As I struggled out of my bloodied uniform jacket, she turned to assist me, her fingers working efficiently at the fastenings. Her touch was clinical, professional, Yet I found myself acutely aware of her nearness, of the faint scent of lavender that clung to her hair. Others? I asked, trying to focus on her words rather than the warmth of her hands as she helped me remove my shirt. Sergeant Mills knows of my work, though he pretends not to see when supplies go missing from the garrison stores. Cook Morrison occasionally provides hot broth for men who need strength to heal. Even Father Benedict has been known to give last rites in this room, when the garrison chaplain was too busy with official duties to attend a dying soldier. Her revelation stunned me. I had assumed her healing work was a solitary rebellion against military protocol, but apparently, there was an entire network of people within the garrison who quietly supported her efforts. You're telling me that half the garrison knows about your unauthorized medical practice? The implication sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the cool autumn air. She paused in cleaning my wound to meet my eyes directly. I'm telling you, Captain, that good people recognize the difference between following orders and doing what's right. The question is, which kind of person are you? Her challenge hung in the air between us like smoke from the fireplace. I had spent my entire adult life believing that following orders and doing what was right were the same thing. The possibility that they might sometimes conflict had never seriously occurred to me before meeting her. Colonel Blackwood would court-martial anyone he discovered supporting unauthorized medical treatment, I said, though even as I spoke, I realized I was avoiding her question rather than answering it. Colonel Blackwood, she said, her voice carrying a note of distaste, is more concerned with maintaining his authority than with the welfare of the men under his command. He would rather see a soldier die following proper protocol than live through irregular treatment. She worked in silence for several minutes, her skilled hands cleaning and examining the wound with gentle thoroughness. The firelight played across her face, highlighting the concentration in her expression, the slight furrow of her brow as she assessed the damage. This needs proper stitching, she said finally. The blade went deeper than your previous injury. You've been fortunate that it missed anything vital, but if it's not treated correctly, infection could kill you as surely as the sword that made it. Then treat it, I said, surprising myself with the immediacy of my response. She looked up at me, her green eyes searching my face as if trying to read my thoughts. Are you certain, Captain? Once I begin the treatment, you become complicit in everything I do here. You can no longer claim ignorance of my activities if questions are asked. I thought of Colonel Blackwood's stern face, of the military regulations that governed every aspect of our lives, of the career I had built through unquestioning obedience to authority. Then I looked at this remarkable woman who risked everything to heal the wounded, regardless of rank or allegiance, and I realized that my answer had been decided the moment I first met her. I'm certain, I said. She nodded once, then turned to select her instruments. This will hurt considerably more than the previous wound. The muscle is torn, and I'll need to work deep to repair it properly. I've endured worse, I replied, though privately I wondered if that was true. Not the physical pain, perhaps, but the emotional upheaval of discovering that everything I thought I believed about duty and honor might be wrong. As she began her work, I found myself studying her profile in the firelight. There was something almost ethereal about her in the dancing shadows, something that made me think of the old stories my grandmother used to tell about wise women who lived between worlds, serving powers higher than earthly authorities. Tell me about your father, I said, partly to distract myself from the pain of her ministrations, partly because I genuinely wanted to know more about the man who had raised such an extraordinary daughter. Her hands never faltered in their work, but I saw something soften in her expression. He was the finest man I ever knew, she said simply. Trained at the University of Edinburgh before the troubles there, but he believed that medical knowledge belonged to anyone willing to learn and use it responsibly. He taught me that healing is a sacred calling, not a profession to be regulated by guilds and governments. She paused to thread a finer needle for the more delicate work ahead. He also taught me that sometimes the most important battles are fought not with swords and cannons, but with quiet acts of compassion that no one will ever praise or remember. Her words resonated in my chest with surprising force. In all my years of military service, I had never thought of compassion as a form of warfare, but listening to her speak, I began to understand that her father had trained her to be a different kind of soldier entirely. What would he think of what you're doing now? I asked. She smiled, and for the first time since I had met her, the expression was entirely without sadness or worry. He would be proud, she said with quiet confidence. And he would probably remind me to be more careful about treating wounded officers who might report my activities to their superiors. I would never, I began, but she shook her head, still smiling. I know, Captain Ravencroft. If I thought otherwise, you would not be here. The simple trust in her voice moved me more than any declaration of love could have done. This woman, who risked everything to heal the wounded, who defied military authority and social convention daily, trusted me completely. The weight of that trust settled on my shoulders like a heavy cloak, and I realized that it was both the most precious gift I had ever received and the most dangerous responsibility I had ever accepted. As the days passed following that second treatment, I found myself thinking about Evangeline Thornwick far more than was appropriate for an officer of His Majesty's forces. The wound she had tended healed cleanly, without the fever and infection that too often claimed soldiers' lives. But something else had taken root in my chest, something that grew stronger with each passing sunrise. I began to notice things I had never seen before. How Cook Morrison would occasionally prepare extra portions and leave them covered near the kitchen entrance, only for them to disappear within the hour. How Sergeant Mills would conduct his evening rounds with unusual thoroughness, always managing to be elsewhere when certain supply discrepancies occurred. How Father Benedict could be found at odd hours in parts of the garrison that held no obvious religious significance. The network Evangeline had described was larger and more sophisticated than I had imagined, and I marveled at how blind military protocol had made me to the quiet rebellion happening under my very nose. 3 weeks after our encounter in the Moonlit corridor, Colonel Blackwood summoned me to his office. Marcus Blackwood was a man who had risen through the ranks on strict adherence to regulation rather than battlefield innovation, and his office reflected that philosophy. Everything was arranged with mathematical precision, from the perfectly aligned maps on his desk to the spotless uniform that never seemed to show the slightest wrinkle. Captain Ravencroft, he said without looking up from the document he was reading, I have some concerns about security within the garrison. My heart began to beat faster, but I kept my expression neutral. What kind of concerns, sir? There have been irregularities in our medical supplies. Bandages, medicines, surgical instruments, all disappearing in quantities too large to be explained by normal usage. He finally looked up, his pale blue eyes studying my face carefully. As one of my most trusted officers, I'm assigning you to investigate these discrepancies and report back to me with your findings. The irony was not lost on me. He was asking me to investigate the very activities that had saved my life, to betray the woman whose courage and compassion had already begun to change my understanding of what it meant to be a man of honor. Of course, sir, I heard myself saying. When would you like my report? 2 weeks should be sufficient. I want names, Captain. I want to know who is stealing from His Majesty's stores, and I want to know why. His voice carried the cold finality of a man accustomed to absolute obedience. These irregularities, and now, I left his office feeling as though the ground beneath my feet had shifted permanently. For the first time in my military career, I had accepted an assignment that I had no intention of completing honestly. The realization should have troubled me more than it did. That evening, I found myself walking the garrison's corridors with no particular destination in mind, simply trying to process the impossible situation I now faced. My steps led me, perhaps inevitably, toward the east wing where I had first encountered Evangeline's hidden sanctuary. I was not entirely surprised to find her there, working by candlelight over a patient I did not recognize. A young soldier, barely old enough to shave, lay unconscious on the wooden table while she cleaned what appeared to be a serious head wound. She looked up as I entered, her expression showing neither surprise nor fear at my unexpected appearance. Private Henderson, she explained quietly, continuing her work without pause. Found unconscious near the north wall. The official report will say he fell during routine patrol, but the wound pattern suggests he encountered Scottish raiders who left him for dead. I approached the table, studying the boy's pale face and the careful way she cleaned around the injury. Will he live? If the swelling in his brain doesn't worsen, and if infection doesn't set in, yes. He has youth on his side, and the skull appears intact beneath the surface damage. Her hands moved with the same confident precision I remembered from my own treatments. He'll need constant monitoring for the next several days. Evangeline, I said, and something in my tone made her pause and look at me directly. Colonel Blackwood has assigned me to investigate the missing medical supplies. I watched her face carefully as I delivered this news, looking for signs of fear or panic. Instead, I saw only a brief tightening around her eyes, followed by a nod of understanding. I see, she said simply. And what will you report to him? I don't know, I admitted. I should report everything I've seen, everything I know about your activities here. It would be the proper thing to do, the military thing to do. She resumed cleaning the boy's wound, her movements steady despite the conversation. But you won't. It wasn't a question, and her quiet confidence in my character moved me more than any plea or argument could have done. No, I said, the word carrying the weight of a decision that would change the course of my entire life. I won't. For the first time since I had entered the room, she smiled, and the warmth of it seemed to fill the candlelit chamber with golden light. Then we have a problem to solve together, she said. Because Marcus Blackwood is not a man who accepts failure from his subordinates. If you cannot provide him with someone to blame for the missing supplies, he will keep investigating until he finds the truth. The casual way she used the colonel's first name surprised me, and she must have noticed my expression because she continued. We knew each other before he received his commission to Ravenshollow. Our fathers served together in the Irish campaigns, and there was a time when he had different ideas about honor and duty. Her voice carried a note of old sadness. Power changes people, Captain. Sometimes not for the better. Private Henderson stirred on the table, mumbling something incoherent in his unconscious state. Evangeline immediately turned her full attention to him, checking his pulse and the dilation of his pupils with practiced efficiency. The danger is increasing, she said as she worked. There have been more raids along the border, more wounded men who need treatment that the garrison surgeon either cannot or will not provide. If Blackwood discovers what we're doing here, it won't just be my life at risk. Everyone who has helped, everyone who has stayed silent, everyone who has chosen compassion over protocol, they'll all face court-martial. I thought of Sergeant Mills with his quiet competence, of Cook Morrison with her generous heart, of Father Benedict with his flexible interpretation of religious duty. Good people, all of them, who had risked their positions and possibly their lives to support her work. There has to be another way, I said, though I had no idea what that way might be. Perhaps there is, she replied, securing fresh bandages around the boy's head. But it would require you to trust me completely, and it would almost certainly end your military career. I looked at her across the candlelit room, this remarkable woman who had already saved my life twice and was now offering to save the lives of everyone who had supported her work. The choice before me was stark in its simplicity, if not in its consequences. Tell me, I said. She finished with her patient before turning to face me fully, her green eyes serious in the flickering light. We disappear, Captain. All of us. The entire network. We leave Ravenshollow before Blackwood can discover our identities, and we establish ourselves somewhere else, somewhere we can continue this work without military interference. The audacity of her proposal took my breath away. She was talking about desertion, about abandoning everything I had worked for, everything I had built my identity around. Where would we go? I asked, surprised to find myself seriously considering her suggestion. North, she said without hesitation. Into Scotland, where the authorities are less interested in English military protocols and more interested in practical results. There are communities there that would welcome healers, regardless of our past affiliations. You're asking me to become a traitor to my own country. I'm asking you to become loyal to something higher than country, she corrected gently. To become loyal to the principle that human life has value regardless of which flag flies over the place where that life began. Her words echoed in my mind long after I left the hidden chamber that night. As I walked back to my quarters through corridors that suddenly felt more like a prison than a home, I found myself questioning everything I had believed about loyalty, duty, and honor. The military had been my life for nearly a decade, but in the space of a few weeks, one extraordinary woman had shown me a different kind of service, a different kind of courage. The next morning brought the first winter frost, coating the garrison's stone walls with a crystalline shell that made everything look both beautiful and treacherous. I stood at my window, watching the sun rise over the Scottish hills in the distance, and tried to imagine what life might be like beyond those peaks, in a place where healing the wounded was seen as virtue rather than violation of protocol. My contemplation was interrupted by urgent knocking at my door. Sergeant Mills stood in the corridor, his weathered face grave with concern. "Captain, sir," he said, glancing around to ensure we were not overheard. "There's been a development you need to know about." I invited him into my quarters, noting the careful way he closed the door behind him and the tension in his shoulders that spoke of serious trouble. "Colonel Blackwood has arrested someone," he said without preamble. "A stable boy named Thomas, caught with medical supplies he claimed to have found abandoned near the north gate." My blood ran cold. Thomas was barely 16, the son of a local farmer who had been granted employment at the garrison as an act of charity after his father was killed in a border raid. If Blackwood was interrogating the boy about stolen medical supplies, it was only a matter of time before someone's name was mentioned. "What exactly did the boy say?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "So far, nothing useful. Claims he found the supplies and was bringing them back when he was caught. But Blackwood has him in the tower cell, and you know what that means." I did know. The tower cell was where the colonel conducted his most intensive interrogations, and Marcus Blackwood was not a man who accepted innocent explanations when he was convinced of guilt. "How long has the boy been there?" "Since dawn." "But Captain," Mills stepped closer, lowering his voice to barely above a whisper. "The supplies he was carrying, they match exactly what's been missing from the medical stores. Someone gave them to him, told him what to say if he was caught. This wasn't an accident." The implications hit me like a physical blow. Someone in our network had been compromised, or worse, someone had deliberately sacrificed the stable boy to protect themselves. Either way, it meant that Blackwood was closer to uncovering the truth than any of us had realized. "Where is she?" I asked, though I didn't need to specify who I meant. "Gone," Mills replied grimly. "Her room above the blacksmith shop was cleared out before dawn. No sign of her or any of her medical equipment." For a moment, I couldn't breathe. The thought that Evangeline had simply vanished, leaving me to face Blackwood's investigation alone, created a hollow ache in my chest that was worse than any physical wound I had ever endured. "Did she leave any message?" I managed to ask. Mills reached into his coat and withdrew a small piece of folded parchment. "This was left with Cook Morrison, with instructions to give it to you, if anything happened." My hands trembled slightly as I unfolded the note. Evangeline's neat handwriting covered half the page, and I could almost hear her voice as I read her words. "Captain Ravencroft, if you are reading this, then our worst fears have come to pass and Colonel Blackwood has begun arresting people. By the time you receive this message, I will be long gone from Raven's Hollow, but I have not abandoned you or anyone else who supported our work. The boy Thomas knows nothing, and Blackwood will find no evidence connecting him to our activities if he is questioned properly. I have taken steps to ensure that the real evidence of our network is destroyed, but I cannot protect everyone if they remain within Blackwood's reach. The choice I offered you before now becomes urgent. If you truly wish to continue serving something greater than military protocol, meet me at the old chapel ruins 3 miles north of the garrison at midnight tomorrow. Come alone, and bring only what you can carry in a single pack. If you do not come, I will understand, and I will remember you always as a good man trapped by circumstances beyond his control. If you do come, know that you will be choosing a path from which there is no return to your former life." The note was unsigned, but I recognized her hand and her voice in every word. She had planned for this possibility, had prepared an escape route not just for herself, but for anyone brave enough to follow her into the unknown. "What will you do, Captain?" Mills asked quietly. I looked at this man who had served faithfully for over 20 years, who had risked his position and his pension to support Evangeline's work, and I realized that he deserved to know the truth about my own intentions. "I'm going to try to save that boy," I said, "and then I'm going to make the hardest decision of my life." Mills nodded slowly, as if he had expected this answer. "The boy won't last long under Blackwood's questioning. He's young and scared, and the colonel has ways of making people talk even when they have nothing useful to say. Then we need to give Blackwood something else to think about," I replied, an idea beginning to form in my mind. Something that will satisfy his need to find a culprit without destroying an innocent boy or exposing the rest of our network. I spent the next hour crafting a careful report for Colonel Blackwood, one that contained enough truth to be credible while directing his suspicions away from the people I now realized I would do anything to protect. According to my fictional investigation, the missing medical supplies were being stolen by a small group of soldiers who were selling them to local farmers for extra money. I included enough realistic details to make the story believable, and I made sure that all the supposed culprits were men who had been transferred to other postings or killed in recent border skirmishes. When I presented the report to Blackwood that afternoon, I watched his pale eyes scan the pages with the hungry intensity of a predator who has finally found prey. "Excellent work, Captain," he said, leaning back in his chair with evident satisfaction. "I knew I could count on your thoroughness and loyalty. These names you've provided, I want them investigated further, their backgrounds examined, their associates questioned." "Of course, sir," I replied, knowing that such investigations would ultimately lead nowhere, but would keep him occupied long enough for the real network to disperse safely. "And the stable boy?" "Released immediately, with apologies for the inconvenience. He appears to have been an innocent victim of circumstances, exactly as he claimed." Blackwood nodded approvingly. "See that it's done. We cannot have it said that His Majesty's forces arrest innocent civilians without cause." I left his office with the taste of deception bitter in my mouth, but with the knowledge that Thomas would be free within the hour and that the people who had risked everything to heal the wounded would have time to escape Blackwood's investigation. That evening, as I sat in my quarters making careful preparations for what might be my final night as Captain Lysander Ravencroft of His Majesty's forces, I found myself thinking about the nature of loyalty. For years, I had believed that loyalty meant unquestioning obedience to authority, unwavering service to crown and country regardless of personal cost. But Evangeline had shown me another kind of loyalty entirely, a deeper allegiance to principles that transcended the arbitrary boundaries of nations and ranks. She had been loyal to the idea that all human life had value, that suffering should be alleviated wherever it was found, that compassion was more important than protocol. If you're watching this story unfold and wondering what choice you would make in my position, I encourage you to share your thoughts in the comments below. Sometimes the most important decisions we face are the ones where both paths seem to lead away from everything we thought we knew about ourselves. As midnight approached, and I prepared to leave everything I had ever known behind, I realized that the young woman who had defied the order to save my life had given me something far more valuable than medical treatment. She had given me the courage to save my own soul. The old chapel ruins stood like broken teeth against the star-filled sky, their Norman stones worn smooth by centuries of Scottish weather. I approached on foot, having left my horse tethered a safe distance away, my heart pounding with a mixture of anticipation and terror at what I was about to do. She was waiting for me in what had once been the nave, her dark cloak making her nearly invisible among the shadows until she moved into a patch of moonlight. The sight of her filled me with such relief that I almost stumbled in my haste to reach her side. "I wasn't certain you would come," she said softly, though her smile told me she had hoped I would. "Neither was I, until this morning," I admitted, setting down the single pack that contained everything I now owned in the world. But watching that boy being dragged away in chains, knowing that good people like Mills and Morrison and Father Benedict were in danger because of their kindness, I realized that some choices make themselves. She stepped closer, close enough that I could see the tears glistening in her green eyes. "You know what this means, Lysander. There will be no going back, no return to the life you knew. Marcus Blackwood will brand you a deserter, and the crown will consider you a traitor. Then I'll be a traitor in service of something that matters more than crowns or flags," I replied, surprised by the conviction in my own voice. "You taught me that healing the wounded is a form of courage. Tonight, you're teaching me that sometimes the most courageous thing a man can do is walk away from a fight that was never worth fighting in the first place." She reached up to touch my face, her fingers cool against my skin in the crisp night air. "The others are safe. Mills has arranged transfers for himself and Morrison to garrisons in Ireland where Blackwood's influence doesn't reach. Father Benedict has requested reassignment to a monastery in Wales. They'll all be gone by dawn. And us. We have a different journey ahead, she said, turning to gesture toward the Scottish hills that rose like sleeping giants in the distance. There's a village called Glenbrook, about 2 days' ride north of here. The people there have been without a proper healer for 3 years, ever since their physician died in a fever outbreak. They won't care about our past affiliations or our reasons for leaving England, only about our ability to help when help is needed. I looked at her standing there in the moonlight, this remarkable woman who had upended my entire understanding of honor and duty, and I felt something settle into place in my chest that I hadn't even realized was missing. "Will you marry me, Evangeline Thornwick?" I asked, the words emerging without conscious thought. Her eyes widened with surprise, then filled with a joy so radiant it seemed to illuminate the ruins around us. "Are you proposing to me in the ruins of a chapel, Captain Ravencroft, while we're both fleeing military justice?" "Former Captain Ravencroft," I corrected with a smile. "And I can't think of anywhere more appropriate. This place has already seen its share of broken vows to earthly authorities. Perhaps it's time for it to witness some new promises to higher powers." She laughed, the sound like silver bells in the winter air. "Then yes, Lysander Ravencroft, I will marry you. But perhaps we should reach Glenbrook before we start planning the ceremony." We gathered our few possessions and began walking north, leading our horses carefully through the darkness. The winter stars provided enough light to navigate by, and with each step away from Ravenshollow Garrison, I felt lighter, as if I were shedding the weight of years of unquestioned obedience. "Tell me about this village we're going to," I said as we walked. "Glenbrook sits in a valley protected from the worst of the border conflicts," she explained, her voice warm with anticipation. "The people there are farmers and shepherds mostly, hard-working folk who judge others by their actions rather than their pedigrees. They've been sending messages south for months, asking for anyone with medical knowledge to come help them. And they won't ask questions about why an English officer and a woman traveling together have suddenly appeared at their gates. They might ask," she said with a smile I could hear in her voice, "but they won't much care about the answers if we can deliver their children safely and treat their sick effectively." As dawn approached, we stopped to rest beside a small stream that chattered its way down from the hills. The water was cold and clear, and we knelt beside it to drink and splash the dust of our journey from our faces. "Do you have any regrets?" Evangeline asked as we shared bread and cheese from my pack. I considered her question carefully, thinking of the military career I had abandoned, the comfortable certainties I had left behind, the approval of men like Colonel Blackwood that I would never again enjoy. "None," I said, and realized with surprise that it was completely true. For the first time in my adult life, I feel like I'm moving towards something rather than simply following orders. I feel like I'm finally becoming the man I was meant to be. She leaned against my shoulder, and I wrapped my arm around her, marveling at how right it felt to hold her close. My father used to say that the measure of a man's life wasn't in the orders he followed, but in the moments when he chose to follow his conscience instead. Your father sounds like he was a wise man. He was, and he would have liked you very much. She turned to look at me, her green eyes serious. He always said that the greatest healers were those who understood that sometimes the most important wounds are the ones inside, the ones that keep us from becoming who we're meant to be. By the time we reached Glenbrook 2 days later, I understood what she meant. The village was everything she had promised, a collection of stone cottages nestled in a green valley where the people welcomed us not with suspicion, but with gratitude. They had heard of Evangeline's reputation as a healer from travelers passing through, and they cared nothing for the circumstances that had brought her to them, only for the skill she brought. Within a week, we had established ourselves in a small house on the edge of the village, with a room set aside for treating the sick and injured. Evangeline worked with the natural authority of someone born to heal, while I found unexpected satisfaction in assisting her, learning skills I had never imagined needing during my military career. We were married by the village priest in a simple ceremony attended by people who had known us for barely a month, but who had already accepted us as part of their community. As I spoke my vows to the woman who had saved not just my life, but my soul, I realized that true courage wasn't about charging into battle or following orders without question. True courage was about choosing love over fear, compassion over protocol, and hope over despair. The young woman who had defied the order to save my life had taught me that sometimes the most important victories are won not with swords and cannons, but with gentle hands and an uncompromising commitment to doing what's right, regardless of the cost. Years have passed since that moonlit night when our journey together began, and not once have I regretted the choice to walk away from everything I thought I wanted in order to find everything I actually needed. Our life in Glenbrook has been rich with purpose, filled with the quiet satisfaction that comes from serving something greater than ourselves. If this story has moved you, if it's reminded you that sometimes the most courageous path is the one that leads away from others' expectations and toward your own truth, I hope you'll subscribe to this channel for more stories about love, courage, and the extraordinary power of choosing compassion over conformity. Because in the end, the greatest love stories aren't just about two people finding each other. They're about two people helping each other become the best versions of themselves. That's the lesson I learned in a moonlit corridor from a young woman who defied every order to save my life, and in doing so, showed me how to save my own soul.